Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, history nerds and accidental clickers, welcome to one of the most ridiculous disasters ever recorded in military history. Forget Waterloo, forget Stalingrad, forget that time Napoleon thought invading Russia in winter was a good idea. No, today we're diving headfirst into the Battle of Karansebes, the only time in recorded history where an army managed to absolutely annihilate itself without the enemy even being in the same zip code. Yes, you heard that correctly. An army of nearly 100,000 soldiers armed with muskets, cannons, sabres, and professional officers managed to defeat themselves so spectacularly that when the Ottomans finally showed up, all they had to do was stroll in and claim victory. Imagine turning up late to a party and finding that everyone has already punched themselves in the face, eaten all the snacks, and set the house on fire. That, dear listener, is the story of Karansebes. But before we get to the main event, the drunken brawl, the miscommunications, and the emperor himself being knocked off his horse by his own men, we need to set the scene. Because chaos like this doesn't just appear out of nowhere. No, it takes years of poor planning, centuries of simmering grudges, and a military command structure so incompetent it makes the Three Stooges look like Napoleon's general staff. So, it's 1788. Europe, as usual, is a mess. On one side, you have the Ottoman Empire, once the terror of Christendom, now a somewhat creaky giant still capable of scaring its neighbours. On the other, the Habsburg monarchy, also creaky, also giant, and run by Emperor Joseph II, a man who had great ideas about reform but very little experience in actual warfare. He had abolished serfdom, modernized administration, and annoyed pretty much every noble in his empire. What he hadn't done was win a war. Still, when Austria declared war on the Ottomans, Joseph II was determined to lead his army personally. And what an army it was, tens of thousands strong, stretching across the frontier. But here's the catch, this army wasn't some tight, unified fighting machine. Oh no, it was more like a music festival with muskets. You had Austrians, Hungarians, Croatians, Wallachians, Serbs, Germans, Poles. Basically anyone who could hold a pike, blow a trumpet, or shout confusing orders in a different language. Now, diversity can be a strength, but in 1788, diversity plus no standardized language equals disaster. Orders shouted in German were misunderstood by Hungarian cavalry. Croatian infantry had no idea what the Wallachians were yelling about. And the Italians probably didn't care either way as long as they got their wine ration. Imagine trying to organize a massive LAN party, except half the players are using keyboards in different alphabets and everyone is slightly drunk. That's the Austrian army in 1788. And it wasn't just the soldiers. The officers themselves often spoke different languages, came from different regions, and hated each other almost as much as they hated the Ottomans. Some were professional career men, others were nobles who had bought their commissions and thought discipline was just a French word meaning something peasants worry about. So what happens when you take this powder keg of languages, cultures, rivalries, and sprinkle it with a liberal dose of alcohol? You get the Battle of Karansebes, or rather, the Brawl of Karansebes, because calling it a battle is a bit generous. Picture it. Late September 1788. The Austrian army is marching through the Banat region of modern-day Romania, near the town of Karansebes. They're on campaign against the Ottomans, but at this exact moment, the enemy is nowhere in sight. The soldiers are tired, hungry, and increasingly cranky from days of slogging through muddy terrain. Then, salvation. A group of cavalry scouts crosses the river and stumbles upon a group of local gypsies, and these enterprising fellows just so happen to have something far more powerful than any cannon or musket: schnapps. Clear, strong, throat-burning alcohol, liquid courage in a bottle. Naturally, the cavalrymen whip out their coin purses and buy up as much as they can carry. After all, what better way to pass a gloomy night in camp than drinking enough schnapps to pickle a horse? So they start drinking, and drinking, and drinking some more. Before long, the cavalry has transformed from elite mounted soldiers into very drunk guys with expensive hats. But word spreads fast in an army camp. Before long, the infantry shows up. They see the cavalrymen clinking glasses and having a grand old time, and they're not happy, because if there's one thing infantrymen can't stand, it's cavalrymen acting smug. And if there's another thing they can't stand, it's cavalrymen hogging all the alcohol. So the infantry demand their share of the schnapps. The cavalry, already well on their way to intoxication, refuse. "We found it, we bought it, we drink it," they slur, probably spilling half of it down their tunics. The infantry respond in the universal language of soldiers everywhere, angry, shouting and shoving. Now remember, this army is a mix of nationalities, so the shouting isn't just "give us the booze," but a multilingual chorus of curses, threats and drunken songs. A Hungarian yells at a German who doesn't understand him. A Croatian shoves a Wallachian who thinks he's being challenged to a duel. And someone in the back is probably singing folk songs just to add to the confusion. And as we all know, when alcohol and weapons mix, things escalate fast. The shoving turns into fists. Fists turn into sabers being drawn. Someone fires a musket into the air. Not at anyone in particular, just the kind of drunk warning shot people do when they want to look tough. But in a camp filled with nervous, multilingual soldiers, that shot is the spark that lights the powder keg. Because at that very moment, some genius hears the musket fire and assumes, wait for it, that the Ottomans are attacking in the middle of the night, across the river, without being spotted. Yes, that's the conclusion they jump to. And so panic spreads. Soldiers start yelling, "Turks! Turks!" in German. Others yell the same in Hungarian or Croatian or Romanian. But to half the army, those words just sound like more angry shouting. Nobody's sure what's happening, but everyone's sure something bad is. Cue mass hysteria. Some soldiers start firing wildly into the darkness. Others, not understanding the language but hearing gunshots, assume they're under attack and fire back. But here's the kicker, they're firing back at their own troops. Infantry shoots at cavalry, cavalry charges infantry, and artillery officers are hearing all this chaos, decide to join the fun by loading and firing cannons in the general direction of the noise. Yes, cannons against their own men. And if you're thinking, surely the officers stepped in and restored order? Oh, sweet summer child, the officers made everything worse. The Austrian camp becomes a swirling tornado of chaos. Gunshots in the dark, drunken cavalry charging, infantry blasting away at shadows, and artillerymen gleefully firing cannons like it's New Year's Eve in Vienna. And remember, this is the 18th century. Night battles were already confusing under the best circumstances. With no floodlights, no radios, and no glow sticks, you basically had the moon, a few lanterns, and your sense of direction, which if you'd been drinking schnapps for 3 hours straight, was about as reliable as a weather forecast from a parrot. So soldiers are stumbling through the dark, tripping over tents, colliding with supply wagons, and shouting at one another in half a dozen languages. And every shout just convinces someone else that the Turks have broken through the lines. It's like a giant game of telephone, except instead of whispering silly phrases, everyone is screaming, "We're all going to die." Some units actually begin full retreats. Cavalrymen, terrified of imaginary Ottomans, spur their horses and bolt through the camp, knocking over tents, wagons, and fellow soldiers. Infantrymen, seeing mounted troops galloping wildly, assume this is a rout and start running too. Soon, entire regiments are in flight, from themselves. The officers, desperate to restore order, shout commands. "Halt! Rally! Hold the line!" But to panicked soldiers in the dark, these shouts sound suspiciously like more enemy voices. In fact, one story claims that German officers yelling "Halt! Halt!" were misunderstood by non-German speakers as "Allah! Allah!", which in their minds meant only one thing: the Turks were indeed upon them. At this point, any semblance of order collapses. Musket volleys are being fired at shadows. Cavalry are slashing wildly with sabres. Artillery crews, convinced an Ottoman horde is charging, light their fuses and unleash cannon fire right into their own camp. Imagine being woken up in your tent by a cannonball crashing through your soup kettle. You'd panic too. And then in the middle of this lunacy, who should appear but Emperor Joseph II himself? Determined to see what the hell is going on, he rides into the maelstrom, probably expecting to find brave Austrians repelling a ferocious Turkish assault. Instead, he finds his own army tearing itself apart like a bar fight at Oktoberfest. Now, Joseph wasn't exactly a hardened battlefield commander. He was an enlightened monarch, fond of philosophy, reforms, and writing long letters. Charging into a stampede of terrified, drunken soldiers was not on his bucket list, and sure enough, things go badly. At some point in the melee, his horse bolts, throws him off, and he ends up trampled in the mud. The Emperor of Austria, supreme commander of the army, is knocked flat on his royal backside by his own troops. Legend has it he was almost run over by a supply wagon as well, which would have been the perfect cherry on top of this tragicomic Sunday. His staff officers managed to drag him out of the chaos, but by then the army is in full rout. Men are fleeing across the river, drowning in the dark as they try to swim to safety. Wagons overturn, supplies are lost, and entire artillery batteries are abandoned. By morning, the Austrian camp looks like it's been hit by a hurricane made of cannonballs, horse hooves, and schnapps bottles. Thousands of soldiers are dead or wounded, not a single Ottoman among them, and the ones who survived are scattered, demoralized, and hungover. And then, of course, the Ottomans arrive. They advance toward Karansebes expecting a real fight. Banners raised, drums beating, sabres gleaming in the sun. They're prepared for a bloody confrontation with one of Europe's great powers. Instead, what do they find? A battlefield littered with corpses, abandoned cannons, wrecked wagons, and Austrian soldiers running for the hills like contestants in a very poorly organized marathon. The Ottomans didn't so much win the battle as inherit it. They basically walked in, looked around, and said, "Thanks, I guess." Reports vary on how many Austrians died that night. Some say as few as 1,200, others claim closer to 10,000. But the important number here is this: Ottoman casualties, 0, not 1. The Turks didn't even fire a shot. This was a 100% self-inflicted defeat. For Joseph II, this was catastrophic. His great campaign against the Ottomans was supposed to cement his reputation as a warrior emperor. Instead, Karansebes turned him into the punchline of Europe. The French laughed, the Prussians laughed, and even the Russians, who were supposed to be his allies, probably snickered behind his back. And Joseph himself, he reportedly never really recovered from the humiliation. The war dragged on, Austria gained little, and within 2 years Joseph was dead, remembered more for his reforms than his military glory. The Battle of Karansebes, if you can even call it a battle, is often held up as the ultimate cautionary tale of military incompetence. It's a story told in military academies as a joke, a kind of what not to do on the grandest possible scale. It makes Custer's last stand look like a tactical masterstroke. And honestly, you have to feel for the ordinary soldiers. Most of them probably had no idea what was going on. Imagine being woken in the dead of night by gunfire, hearing shouts you don't understand, and then seeing your comrades charging at you with drawn swords. You'd fire back too. Add schnapps to the equation, and the whole thing was doomed from the start. But let's be fair, the Austrians aren't the only army in history to suffer from friendly fire. Armies across the ages have occasionally shot at themselves in confusion. What makes Karansebes special is just the scale of it. This wasn't one regiment accidentally ambushing another. This was an entire army, tens of thousands of men, managing to rout itself without the enemy lifting a finger. It's like losing a chess match because you threw your pieces at your own king. Today, the battle survives less as a serious military episode and more as a piece of comic history. A reminder that human error, language barriers, and a few barrels of schnapps can topple empires just as effectively as any invading army. And maybe there's a lesson in that. Sometimes the gravest threat isn't the enemy outside your gates. Sometimes it's the chaos you create inside your own camp. Or, as the Austrians of 1788 might put it, beware the schnapps, it's more dangerous than the Turks. Now you might be thinking, surely this is a one-off. Surely no other army in history has managed to one-punch itself into oblivion quite like the Austrians did at Karansebes. And in a way, you're right. This level of sheer, catastrophic slapstick is rare. But Karansebes belongs to a proud tradition of military disasters so ridiculous they sound like bad comedy sketches. Take, for example, the Fourth Crusade. The Crusaders set out to reclaim the Holy Land, but instead of reaching Jerusalem, they somehow ended up attacking and looting Constantinople, the Christian city they were supposed to be defending. Imagine launching a charity fundraiser for puppies and accidentally setting fire to a cat shelter. Whoops. Or consider the charge of the Light Brigade in 1854. 600 British cavalrymen, armed with sabres, charged straight into a valley lined with Russian artillery because of a bungled order. It was glorious, yes, but also suicidal. Alfred Lord Tennyson wrote a poem about it, which is basically Victorian England's way of saying, well, that was dumb, but at least it rhymed. And then there's Napoleon's attempt to invade Russia in winter. Spoiler alert, it didn't end well. Frostbite, starvation, and a general sense of maybe snow is stronger than cannonballs destroyed the Grande Armée. Compared to that, Karansebes looks almost efficient. At least the Austrians managed to get it over with in one night, no long march required. But Karansebes still stands apart. Most military disasters have an enemy actively helping the process along. The Ottomans at Karansebes didn't even have to show up. They just arrived, looked at the smouldering wreckage and said, "Cool, free cannons." And let's not forget the real heroes of this tale, schnapps and bad communication. If schnapps were a general, it would have been promoted on the spot. And as for the language barriers, well, that's what happens when your army speaks a dozen tongues and no one bothers to make a phrase book. A single multilingual translator might have saved thousands of lives. Instead, confusion ruled the night. Now imagine being one of those Ottoman soldiers marching up to Karansebes the next morning. You've been told the fearsome Austrian army is camped ahead, tens of thousands strong. You brace for a desperate battle, and instead you find an empty camp, broken wagons, cannons pointed the wrong way, and the faint sound of hangovers groaning in the distance. That must have been the easiest victory parade in history. Even centuries later, historians can't help but chuckle when they tell this story. It's often introduced with phrases like, "legend has it," or "according to some accounts," because honestly, it sounds too absurd to be true, but the sources are there and the broad strokes are undeniable. Austria lost a battle against itself. And what of Joseph II, the poor emperor? Well, to his credit, he didn't try to spin it as some brilliant tactical maneuver. He didn't say, "We were merely rehearsing self-defense against ourselves." No, he just quietly let the story slip into the shadows, where it was passed around by amused officers and foreign diplomats. Sadly for him, history has a long memory, and the emperor who abolished serfdom but lost a war to schnapps is a hard title to shake. But perhaps the best way to honor the memory of Karansebes is not with scorn but with appreciation, because it proves something fundamental about humanity. No matter how powerful we become, no matter how many cannons, horses, or brightly polished uniforms we assemble, we remain gloriously capable of screwing everything up in the most spectacular fashion possible. So the next time you feel embarrassed because you tripped in public, sent an email to the wrong person, or dropped your phone in the toilet, remember this: you could be Emperor Joseph II, leading 100,000 men, and still find a way to be outsmarted by your own schnapps supply. And that, dear listener, is the enduring legacy of the Battle of Karansebes. Not strategy, not tactics, not glory or empire, but a universal reminder that sometimes the biggest enemy isn't out there in the dark. Sometimes it's your own side, your own fear, and your own terrible decision-making after a few too many drinks. So raise a glass, carefully, not too many, to the Austrian army of 1788, the only force in history to prove that you don't need an opponent to lose a war. All you need is schnapps, confusion, and a spectacular gift for disaster. I really hope you enjoyed this bedtime story and wish to give it a thumbs up. Please consider subscribing and leaving a comment too. It really means a lot.